with the Jacobean era, that's obviously just the time in which the play was made, right? So why is it the Jacobean era? Because who was King of England at the time? And Shakespeare's in England. So King James, weirdly enough, it becomes Jacob. For some reason, James and Jacob are like the same name because of the roots of the name. But anyway, he was King James of Scotland, and then he becomes King James the First of England. But he was like King James the Sixth or the Fourth. I think it was the Sixth of Scotland. And then because Queen Elizabeth, the Elizabethan era was Queen Elizabeth. Is everyone familiar with the Elizabethan era? You probably remember that from other Shakespearean plays you studied that were written earlier. So there's no huge difference between Elizabeth and Jacobean era. The Elizabethan, it's the same country, the same society. There's slightly different emphasis, but look when it's produced there. It's so early on, as if the whole country is suddenly going to change in what they value in that amount of time. So everything you learn about the Elizabethan era is basically the same as the Jacobean era. King James, though, right, from Scotland, came over to England because Queen Elizabeth died and she didn't have an heir. So there was no prince. There was no one to come up and take the throne from her. Actually, England was really anxious in the lead up to this, because if you have an heirless queen, you don't know who's going to lead you. Remember, you need a leader as a country. So what happened was all of these other people fought. They fought to take over because obviously all the other kings and queens around, well, mainly the kings there, are all fighting to take over this country. They want to be the leader of England. So King James of Scotland basically wins that battle and he becomes the king, right? So now we enter the Jacobean era. Values are very similar. King James had an extra emphasis on renewing religious fervor, which is like F-E-R-V-O-U-R, which is like passion, right? And he was Protestant. So it's not the Catholics that are dominating, it's Protestants that are dominating at this time, okay? We've got Christianity, so it's got the supernatural, feudalism, and then you can put in brackets revenge, honor, duty. The great chain of being was basically an Elizabethan, now Jacobean, again, it's the same thing, social hierarchy. It's a social hierarchy, which said that God's at the top, and then the king or queen is next, right? The monarch. Then there's the prince, the heir to the throne. Then there are the nobles, the people who, remember, live in the castle and are basically born into that kind of higher status. Then there are the lower status people, the commoners, right? Then there are basically like rocks at the bottom of society. So there's basically this hierarchy. And if you disrupt that hierarchy, there is supernatural intervention. So they believed that if the king or queen was killed or murdered, like not rightfully, like they weren't killed in battle by another king, someone just basically came up and murdered them for their own, out of their own self-interest, maybe they were trying to take over the throne. So you see that in a lot of plays. Then when that happens, there's supernatural consequences. They believe that ghosts would come and that you needed to get that order back in line. So if you killed the king or queen unrightfully, then actually there would be supernatural consequences and society would be in chaos. Now the other thing as well is that it's patriarchal. Does everyone see how those sub-dot points are the things that you actually need to mention in conjunction with the Jacobean era? So you don't just mention the Jacobean era. You mention one of the values of the Jacobean era if you're going to make a link. So when I said make a link to context with your evidence, I'm talking about those dot point links. The age of discovery. So that's that period of mass colonization. There were conflicting views about the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Some people thought that the natives on these islands and territories that were being colonized, savages. So there's the perception of them as savages, and the Westerners think that they're superior and they must be more human than them. And yet, there was another point of view, and that's where it becomes Michel de Montaigne's essay, right? It's a subversive essay. So everyone should mention this essay in their essay. It was a very famous essay that Shakespeare knew about, the ideas he certainly knew about, and it was called Of Cannibals. And basically it would suggest that Prospero is actually a tyrant, that he is the savage, and that the colonized, the person who was already on the island, like Caliban, was actually the more human person who was in touch with nature. What's also interesting on that age of discovery point was that there was actually a ship called the Sea Venture, and it was actually shipwrecked in Bermuda in 1609, a year before the play was written. And Shakespeare actually refers to Bermuda in the play. So that news had got back, and I think he was trying to play upon that recent news of another ship, which was the Sea Venture. Okay, and then of course the emergence of the slave trade in Africa. Think about how Caliban becomes a slave to Prospero. That's alluding to the emergence of the slave trade. So whenever you talk about evidence to do with these ideas of control, imprisonment, you should be making links to one of these specific things. It doesn't need to be more than one at a time, because that can get too hard to put into the sentence.